Polls have now closed after Angolans voted in a tight race. Incumbent President Joao Lourenco is seeking re-election, but he's facing stiff competition from opposition UNITA leader Adalberto Costa Junior. UNITA has worked hard to shrug off its past as a rebel movement.
For the very first time, Angolans in the diaspora have voted. They're quite pleased with this move as it enables more people to vote across the globe. The Angolan embassy in South Africa is one of the 3 polling stations in the country.
I'm feeling quite good. It's a very important day for our country and for all Angolans, not just here, but all around the world, and especially back home.
If you choose the right president for yourself, they will do their best to create jobs, to create better opportunities for us as young people. So I personally can't say much about if they're going to do what they say they're going to do from their whole speech and everything.
It is an amazing feeling being able to vote, being able to be part of this whole process outside our country. I feel honored.
The SADC observers and other groupings are out on the ground to monitor the polls. The ANC and a strong ally, the MPLA, are quite happy about what has transpired in Angola so far.
Everywhere we have been, the elections are very peaceful. People are going into the polls. We found it to be much more organized, and we think that Angola in particular, from a point of view of having free and fair elections, because one of the most important elements of the African National Congress and MPLA and all liberation movements is that we need to really move towards ensuring that there's free and fair elections.
The electoral body further says it's quite satisfied with the developments.
The people is so exciting to vote because it's the first time the Angolans are voting out of the country, and people is so exciting. They are voting. Yeah, they would like to exercise their rights to choose the next president, the next government.
The young and old came out in South Africa away from home to vote, and a lot of the voters are quite adamant their vote will definitely make a difference in their country. Khalihle Khumalo, SABC News, Pretoria.
Independent consultant Marisa Lourenco specializes in political and economic risk in Africa, with a special focus on Angola, Mozambique, South Africa, Zambia and Zimbabwe. She joins us now via Zoom. Marisa, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Good to talk to you again. Tell us what you've been able to assess in terms of how voting went today.
Hi, thanks for having me on the show again. So from what we can tell, what's happened today is that, as expected, the elections proceeded relatively peacefully. There were no major disruptions. People generally tended to get up quite early to vote. So polling stations opened at 7, they closed at 5. Most people got it out the way early in the morning. There was a little bit of discontent when some polling stations opened an hour later, but nothing that led to any kind of scuffles or anything. So generally a peaceful day of voting.
Do we have a sense yet of the voter turnout? Did people come out in their numbers?
They don't appear to have come out in their numbers, and definitely it was busier in the morning than in the afternoon. It's a little bit too soon to get a sense of just how many people did vote. We're probably not looking at much higher than last time, but potentially the youth have come out and voted much more than the older generation.
And this is, for many of them, the first time they get to vote. And the question must be, when they go to put their tick on the ballot box, they don't have a lot of the historical baggage that these political formations have. So what will they be voting for when they look at the names on that voting ballot?
Well, it's quite interesting because I think that while it's true, that this generation hasn't grown up in the same environment where it viewed loyalty to liberation movements as a central part to its vote. They have grown up with an influence of the previous generation and their party affiliation, and I know that doesn't play as much of a role in decision making, but I think it does still play some small role. I think that what we're likely to see in this election is that supporters of the opposition would have gone out and voted, and then obviously supporters of the MPLA might have felt, okay, they need to go to make sure that the party stays with its parliamentary majority. But then I think we've also maybe got a group in the middle that sort of felt, well, the MPLA is not doing what we'd like it to do, but actually we don't believe that any other political party can, and they would have abstained.
Is there any hint that there might be some pressure to make sure that a certain result comes through?
Well, like we've spoken about the fact that the vote is counted centrally in Luanda instead of provincially as it used to be before, and how this really does favor the ruling party because the courts and the National Electoral Commission are partial to the MPLA. And of course, the fact that by counting it centrally and not provincially, you do remove a layer of transparency that is critical to the vote count. In terms of there being mass intimidation at polling stations, there have been a few scuffles reported, but no sort of broader issue that we've seen come up yet. The vote is still being counted. The preliminary results should be due in about 72 hours. And then I think we'll sort of start to get a sense of whether or not vote rigging has been a major concern here.
All right. Traditionally, how quickly are they able to get the votes counted and results start coming through?
So the National Electoral Commission will have to have them ready within 48 to 72 hours, but the final electoral result needs to come out within a maximum of 15 days. So what we're going to likely see is over the next 3 days is we'll get the preliminary result, and then we'll get a sense of whichever party loses, whether or not they will choose to approach the Electoral Commission to have a recount, or then if they will approach the courts. So it's difficult to see at this stage, but by the end of the weekend, we should have a sense of who's actually been leading in the initial vote count. And then after that, we'll get a sense of, will this be challenged? And if it will, how will that look? So definitely a very interesting weekend ahead in Angola.
I believe that this year, for the first time, Angolans in the diaspora get to vote. Is there a significant number?
So no, it's a very, very small percentage. I think it's less than 1%. To be honest, I think this was really a tactic by the ruling administration, to sort of show that it has, made some changes. This is something that former President José Eduardo dos Santos would not have allowed. And this is something, that has happened. I think it's a very special moment for Angolans abroad, but in terms of it having a broader impact on the vote, that's not something that we expect. What the votes that are really going to count are the votes in your major cities, particularly Luanda, because this is where you've got the urban youth, and this is where socioeconomic inequality is really felt by Angolans more than that of Angolans abroad.
One of the big challenges across the continent we've been seeing is female participation in terms of running for office. What's been the story in Angola? Are more and more women stepping up and being allowed to participate in the political process?
There is adequate representation of women in parliament in Angola. Its constitution does set out a minimum requirement, which it broadly adheres to. The vice presidential candidate for the MPLA, for example, is a woman. So, there's sort of good representation there. Whether or not that allows women's issues to take the forefront in parliament and in politics more generally is, I think, up for debate. But in terms of representation, Angola doesn't fare too badly.
All right. And are citizens generally politically aware, or are they just focused on bread and butter issues?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that there is definitely a feeling, that UNITA has been quite good at stirring up, which is that there are popular frustrations that the MPLA, especially under Dos Santos and even under Lourenço, has not really been able to help the wealth trickle down, despite the fact that Angola is, the continent's second largest oil producer. So it kind of ties in together. Politics and bread and butter issues do come together. Having said that, though, I do think that there is a little bit of disillusionment with the overall political environment, because essentially we have really seen the MPLA ruling the country for 4 decades, kind of as a one-party state, which, it's understandable if people feel that perhaps the ballot box is not the best way to bring about change.
What's in play for President Lourenço? One thing, yes, he wants to win, but at the same time, I suppose he wants to paint a picture, not just domestically, but abroad as well.
Yes, definitely. He really still wants to prove, that he has marked a change from his predecessor, that the MPLA is governing in a different way. In some ways it is, with respect to the broader macroeconomic environment, and in some ways it isn't. There's still, some repression of the media, of civil society. He still hasn't held local elections, which is something that he promised when he was campaigning for his first term. But definitely the work that Lourenço has done during his first term, especially in improving ties to the West, in getting help from the IMF. He's also projecting kind of soft power across the DRC and Rwanda, kind of serving as a buffer in between that. He wouldn't necessarily, want to let that go so easily. I think a president also always wants a second term. A first term is also kind of a little bit of a chess game, shifting around allies so that you make sure that you create a new hierarchy of people that are loyal to you. He's built that now. There are still some internal divisions within the MPLA, and he would hope that in his second term, he'd be able to operate with a lot more authority than previously, even though there is, of course, the possibility that if the MPLA gets less than 50%, but he still manages to get voted in as president of the country, he will have a weaker presidency. So that, I think, is one of the more interesting points that we're waiting to see if that comes out of this election.
All right, so Marisa, we're going to leave it there. As always, thanks very much indeed for your insights, and perhaps we get to chat again once the results starts coming through. But thanks so much indeed for update today.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. All right, that's Marisa Lourenço. No relation to the president, she told me, speaking to us about the election day process that unfolded today in Angola. The tightest race, they say, since the country opened up to multi-party politics in 1992. It was independent, of course, in 1975, getting its independence from Portugal at the same time as its Lusophone brother-sister Mozambique.